In a world where entertainment is viewed as mindless diversion, only good for momentary distraction, you are about to enter a new world, and you will never view entertainment in the same way again. This is Popcorn Theology.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Delicious things to eat.
The popcorn can't be beat.
Welcome, movie lovers and theology nerds, to Popcorn Theology, where we examine films for where they align with the greatest story and our greatest storyteller, discussing what to receive, reject, and redeem for common ground, fruitful conversation, and mindful movie consumption. I'm Richard.
And I'm David. And this time we're stepping away from our usual fare to talk with Dave Bahnsen about his newest book, Full Time: Work and the Meaning of Life. Welcome to the program.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be with you guys.
Awesome. We're really excited about it. Can you just, before we get started, tell us a little bit about yourself, basic overview about the book, where people can find more of your work, that sort of thing?
Sure. I mean, in a nutshell, I spend my days running a private wealth management firm called the Bahnsen Group. It's not just a coincidence that the name of the company is the Bahnsen Group. It's actually named after me. But that would be a pretty big coincidence if David Bahnsen was running a firm called the Bahnsen Group and it had no connection. We run about $5.5 billion on behalf of our clients, and I live in New York City and Newport Beach, California. Go back and forth every month between those two cities. And we have offices in 7 locations. And this is the life I chose. The book is about my belief regarding work and vocation and calling and purpose and meaning. And there's a website where people can find all kinds of info on the book, fulltimebook.com. And at that website, we have, video clips and excerpts and reviews and lots of blurbs and bells and whistles and things like that. But it essentially gives people an overview about what the message of the book is about.
Fantastic. Excellent. We're very much looking forward to discussing that. And I will say that I think this is the first time that we've had an economist on our podcast. I believe we've had film directors, producers, actors, Richard, corrections officers. So there we go. Bankers, judges, heavy metal singers, astrophysicists, paleontologists, missionaries, etc. But first time having a financial advisor / economist. And so if we ever had you on to discuss a movie, I would be to do a typical movie episode. I'd be fascinated to see what we landed on for that. I also wanted to mention that I'm a big fan of your work on the World and Everything in It podcast. And so I know that you're involved with the Monday Money Beat on that. So I listen to you every Monday. Fantastic. I really appreciate your clear and calm analysis. That's definitely appreciated in a age of highly, incendiary news. It's nice to have a rational voice in the midst of all that. So I greatly appreciate your work on that.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, and it means a lot to me because of all the different things I could try to be in such a venue. Rational and calm is near the top of the list, so I'm glad I'm coming near that target. I absolutely love doing that podcast. Those are wonderful listeners, and Nick does a great job, and I think World has done a really wonderful job building out that whole product.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I'm going to have to check that out because I'm actually ignorant of this podcast. So I'm going to check that out now that you guys are talking about it.
Yes, highly recommend.
So we always like to ask our guests, no matter what we're talking about, we are primarily a movie podcast. We talk about theology and film. Do you have any favorite movies? Or are you more of like a TV guy? Is there anything that like someone asks that question jumps to your mind?
I love movies more than anyone you have ever had on your podcast.
Wow.
Okay.
And it's
that's bold.
It's a not guilty pleasure. At one point in my young adult life, had a lot more time to watch movies than I do now. But if it were up to me, I not only would watch many more movies when they come out than I do, I would watch them in a theater and not
Mhm.
streaming at home, and I would watch them by myself. Now, I am just taking for granted that my wife is not going to be listening to this, because I do love movie dates with my wife too, of course, but I have always loved going to movies by myself too. And I don't know
Mm.
why. I'm kind of a loner at heart. But, it's difficult these days because I find the whole genre of the kind of comic book superhero deal. I may have caught an Avengers or two with my kids when they were growing up, but the entire genre bores me to tears, and that's pretty much taken out like every single movie for 15 years now, it seems. But as a child of the 80s and 90s, my Goodfellas, Scent of a Woman, Shawshank Redemption,
Ooh, there we go.
um, A Few Good Men. I have a few of
Mhm.
the all-time greats there that I've probably seen 100 times each.
Fantastic. Great choices. I'm curious. You mentioned alone and in a theater. Is that in a theater that is completely empty, or do you mind if there's other people around?
No, I prefer it, but I've never been able to pull that off. I generally have to deal with other customers. I've actually rented out whole theaters before for like client showings of movies and opening night kind of VIP things. So we've done that a couple times, but then I'm inviting other people. But yeah, as far as sometimes you walk in and there's not a lot of other people there. That's always kind of nice. The
Yeah.
popcorn line is very short.
hmm I was going to say, if you lived in some of the smaller towns that Richard and I have frequented, then you may have a bit more luck getting an empty theater than in
I
New
think I've
York
had
or
it one
Newport
time.
Beach.
One time
Oh,
I pulled it
really?
off where
Oh
I
man,
went
I've
in
been
and
in
it
empty
just happened.
theaters
It was me and
many
my
times.
son. It was me and my son. So
Wow.
preface, I wasn't completely alone, but it was just us. It was a rare occurrence.
If you go like 11 in the morning in Martinsburg, West Virginia, to a small theater, oh yeah, you got the
Right.
whole thing to
You
yourself.
got a
No
good
one else
chance.
is there. No one else
You
is
got a
there.
good chance.
And
Uh,
they'll still play the movie.
I wonder if no one showed up,
Yep.
maybe they wouldn't. But if I'm there, it's not always the nicest theater, the best time of day, but it's you get the whole place to yourself, which is pretty nice. So
Yeah.
now I will mention this as we're moving on, in case anybody was wondering if why the name Bahnsen sounds familiar. There's a very good reason for that, and I will be ashamed to admit it took me the longest time to put this together myself. That your father was Greg Bahnsen. Do people often make that connection with you, or is that people often don't run in the same circles
Well,
with the two?
it depends on what the circle is. If people are familiar with me from the world and everything in it, then they certainly do. I mean, if there's a limited number of people that are familiar with Greg Bahnsen, but I think the uniqueness of the last name is is usually a pretty good giveaway. Yeah.
Fair enough. I will say I'm a bit of a putz, and I didn't put it together. I thought, oh, how about that? They have the same last name. Okay. It didn't even occur to me that you were related, and so we've definitely referred to your father a number of times on the
Oh,
show. Big fans of his work. No, probably none more than Richard here.
Yeah, I'm going to say
so
he's.
you know that Greg Bahnsen was a bigger movie fan than even I have told you I am. Now
Oh, hold
that's a
on, hold
guy.
on.
That's a guy who watched a lot of movies by himself.
Would you be able to give us his favorite movie?
Ooh.
Or maybe at one or two of his favorite movies, because this could be like really interesting information to have.
You heard it here, folks.
Yeah, that's a great question because he talks so much about the music and the TV shows he liked. But as far as his very favorite movie, he loved the movie The Natural, Robert Redford. But like I wonder from his own childhood or high
Yeah.
school years if he would have had a movie, and I hate to answer for him because I would only know the movies he loved, that I watched with him in the 80s and 90s. But just as a genre, he did not miss a single James Bond movie. He loved them.
Wow.
And that's
Okay.
back when
Okay.
they were good. And I
Yes.
know his favorite James Bond movie because he was big on the whole Sean Connery versus Roger Moore thing. He would have said Goldfinger was his favorite James Bond movie.
All right.
Nice.
Good choice.
Nice. So Greg Bahnsen, your father, is probably the most read author that I can think of in my personal life. So I was excited to get to chat with you a little bit, like Van Til's Apologetic. I return to that about once every 2 or 3 years. That's all I can handle of that book without taking a break from it. Some difficult concepts in there. I don't know if you can even see them, but I pulled a couple of my books out and put beside me just for recording today. But loved a lot of your father's work, and that kind of made me wonder, and maybe this is a good way to segue into discussing the book a little bit more. Did your dad, and I'm going to assume yes, but what impact did your dad have in how you do view work and the theology of work that you have, that sort of thing?
Yeah, well, I'll tout another podcast, although it's not an ongoing podcast. I did a little special mini series for the book called On the Hook. And the very last episode was kind of a special double bonus episode of On the Hook, was me going through, I think I probably listened to about 40 sermons and lectures he gave, and I took excerpts from 22 of them and played clips and then offered my own commentary back and forth. We did this whole kind of interactive produced podcast of my dad talking in the 70s and 80s about work. And so he not only had a extraordinary theology of work, but he was very prescient. He was very ahead of his time, talking in the early 1980s about the negative effect that labor unions were having on work, and the danger of adopting more socialistic or progressive policies in the name of helping workers, and in reality, what it was doing to the souls of people that God had in fact created to work. So he had a very philosophical, as he did with everything, a very philosophical approach to the subject, and he modeled work in every ounce of breath in his body. So my book is dedicated to him. He was my best friend, my mentor, my hero, and he was the hardest working person I ever saw in my life.
Wow, that's incredible. Perhaps that answers this next question that I have as we shift towards discussing a bit of a theology of work. But I was curious if there was a particular incident, a particular inciting incident that made you decide to write this particular book. And if you could also just tell our audience a bit about what you hope that the book will accomplish.
Well, the latter question is probably easier to answer, because what I hope the book will accomplish for the Christian audience is a restoration, a reminder, a repoking of the fundamental message that work is what we were created to do. That the creational normative is that God made us to work, that we work because he worked, and that this is all something that is true before sin entered the world. That that work was not a byproduct of post-fall reality, but rather was intrinsic to the very thing God made us for, and is in fact the definitional component of us being image bearers of God. And so that is the thing that animates me in writing the book. I think the first question about there being a particular incident or event that would have provoked it, I would say no, but I do think there was a culmination of burden over time. If I thought that this was an issue that the world was getting wrong, that culture was headed in the wrong direction with, which I do, I don't think that alone would have animated me to write the book. But there's a lot of things I think the world's getting wrong, but hopefully the church is there standing athwart, trying to fight against. The problem for this subject for me is I think the church is almost worse than the world on it. I don't think the church is a effective counter to any downgraded view of work that we're seeing in the culture. I think the church is an accomplice in that. And it's something that is, to me, very theologically rooted, and has made improvements to some degree on the margin over the last couple of decades, but has a lot of room to go. And so as a man of faith, I believe that when I see something going astray in the church, and it's an issue that animates me in the culture, that kind of double whammy put me in front of my keyboard.
Excellent. Very good point.
That makes a lot of sense. And I was kind of figuring that was the case, that it wasn't like one big thing that happened, but it's just the culmination of everything you're observing. And it's something that you have, some degree of expertise and knowledge in, something to offer the church and the world to speak into. So I kind of figured that was the case. You kind of started talking about the theology behind work a little bit already, and that was kind of where my next question was going. One of the things that I really keyed in on in the early chapters of your book was when you're talking about hopelessness and how that's sort of all over the place, and that people are kind of lost in a lot of ways and groping for some sort of happiness or feeling of fulfillment or whatever you want to call it. And you kind of point to a proper view of work and work itself as maybe one of the possible antidotes to that. Can you speak to that a little bit, and maybe why you think that is? Why is it that God created us in that way, that we're so tied to work?
Yeah, I think that you're exactly right, that I believe we're in this bizarre time in which people say, and I'm in agreement with them, by the way, people say that society is more alienated and isolated and lonely and depressed than it's been before. And I think that's true. And we talk about the empirical measurements of that in higher suicide rates, God forbid, and drug and alcohol abuse and other sort of social ills and anxieties that are really for any decent human being intolerable. And yet we're told that work is a cause of some of these problems. And I find it bizarre, because I do believe that work represents a solution to these problems. And it's one thing to misidentify a cause, it's another thing to misidentify a solution. But when you misidentify the cause for the solution, then you've really gotten things backwards. And that's where I think we are now. Biographically, I am really candid and transparent about this in the book, that one of the reasons I believe work can be very cathartic to a person is because it's what it was for me. And my father died as I was starting off my young adult life, and my mom was already gone. I had nothing and nobody, and work served as a very healthy diversion against the challenges of that era represented, as I had to take the time to kind of answer a lot of those questions in life and help to find some purpose. So, but your question is why that is. And I think the why is because it's how God created us. That if God created us to work, then it stands to reason that in finding that purpose, we find something that is soul satisfying. That there is something intrinsic to work in which we have to serve others. We have to create value. We have to have usefulness, and otherwise no one will pay us. And so in the process of us not merely serving ourselves, but having our needs met by serving others, it feeds, just from a very raw psychological at a raw psychological level, it feeds self-esteem the right way. We've talked about self-esteem in our country for, I think, 30 or 40 years, and it's usually been rooted to some form of delusion. Like, I always laugh about the fact that when they poll students, their math scores are the worst they've been, science is the worst it's been, English is the worst it's been, but self-esteem is doing better. And I think you're feeling better about the fact you can't read or write or count or something. I don't know. It doesn't seem like it's going in the right direction. But to me, self-esteem is something that should follow an activity, not just looking in the mirror and some form of unhealthy self-love. And work provides that venue for us to feel better about ourselves by meeting the needs of others.
Absolutely. And I think you raise a great point. I know growing up, I struggled with this thought that work was part of the fall. I misread or misunderstood, or perhaps was poorly taught from Genesis, that in Genesis 3, the labor that is referred to in the curse was work itself, when really it was if I understand correctly now, a increase in the toil aspect of the labor, rather than the joyful aspect, because Adam and Eve, again, were placed in a garden. They were not placed in a place, they were placed in an area where work was the expectation. And so one of our other hosts who's not able to join us today, Eric George, had an excellent question related to this. He wanted to know if you could talk about the difference between busyness and actually working. For example, digging a hole, then filling it up again, saying you did some work, versus digging a hole and planting a tree or whatever, digging a ditch for some other function, some other purpose.
Well, this is why economists talk about the term output, because busyness is not in and of itself work. And it also gets to the heart of what the point of business activity is, or human action is. And I think this has, I'm in the weeds a little bit now, but this has a really profound impact on how we think about economics and policy. Is people sometimes say, we shouldn't do that. It's going to destroy jobs, even if it's better for the business, even if it's going to serve customers more, even if it's going to generate more profits, even if it's going to produce more goods and services. It also will do so with less people. And Milton Friedman used to say the purpose of a business is not to create jobs. Otherwise, we would all dig holes with spoons. You will need to hire a lot more people to do all your handiwork if all they can use is a spoon. And things like tractors at a more base level, just shovels, let alone, wheelbarrows and things. And then all the way to post-industrial revolution, much more sophisticated technology. It's all naturally enhancing productivity, all the while doing so with less labor requirement. And yet we have more people employed than ever, despite the addition of engineering or industrial or even digital technology that has allowed us to do more with less. And so I always want to make sure we're clear what the aim is. This is a Greg Bahnsen thing. First principles, the aim is production of goods and services that meet the needs of humanity. You're enhancing someone's quality of life when you're producing something. And of course, in a market economy, sometimes you produce something and the customer doesn't like it. So the market value is not based on how hard you worked or how hard you tried or even how much labor was put into it. That was a Marxian mistake, a labor theory of value. The value comes from the subjective preferences of the customers that either like your product or don't like it. And yet, nevertheless, that's the aim, is to be producing things that are meeting needs and wants. And so I believe that keeping that fundamental aim in mind is really pivotal in this whole topic.
Absolutely. It seems like an appropriate time to say that if anyone listening appreciates the labor that we put into producing this podcast, consider supporting us on Patreon, subscribing, doing all that stuff. And we'll keep it to that. Keep it nice and brief today. And of course, definitely consider buying full-time, buying the book. And so as we transition here, this is a film podcast, right, Richard?
We are. We're a film podcast. That's our bread and butter. We discuss movies most of the time. That's why we kind of started there. But there was a line, I actually saw it in the press kit that you guys sent out about the book, and then I started reading the book, and I saw it in the book as well, and it definitely struck me as something that, for our podcast purposes, would be fun to talk about. And I just copied the line from the press kit because in the moment, I couldn't find it in the book again, even though I had read it in the first couple chapters. But the line was, discover why we don't need another movie about a person working too hard who realizes they need to spend more time with their family.
Yeah.
And that what we actually need is a movie about a person not working hard enough who realizes they may need to spend more time working. I wanted to flesh that out some, but if you could elaborate on that a little bit first, maybe in your own words, explain that a little bit. But then I kind of wanted to explore maybe some movies we can talk about that might get this wrong or maybe a little bit closer to right, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I actually use a real specific movie as an example, which is a movie I love that my wife and I watch every single year during the holidays. That is a case in point. But then as a genre, I talk about the kind of Hallmark movies that every one of them is some version of some guy who goes back to the small town he's from. He's been working hard at his corner office in Chicago, but while he's there in the small town, he finds the ex-girlfriend from high school, or finds that the small town needs him to help save the local train station or something, and then he quits the big corporate job that's been taking away all of his energies, and he can do something meaningful and romantic and special in his life by leaving the big bad career behind and going back to the small town to fall in love and all this stuff. And people love those movies. They're all essentially exactly the same around the kind of framework I just described. And I don't mean to be harsh about it, but the fundamental message of it is just utter nonsense and just complete drivel. But I still like the movies. I'm not trying to, be a Scrooge here when it comes to this holiday idea. But even apart from the Hallmark movies, which are themselves almost a borderline satirical genre, just the general theme in Hollywood is always some form of the Gnostic notion that there is kind of a metaphysical meaning that is truly special, some kind of Buddha on the mountaintops person who is out, who really just gets it, versus the personification in the movie of a person who's ambitious and vertically mobile, and ergo a bad person. And I'm tired of it. I think that we do need, I say it to be kind of funny, but I am quite literally saying I do think a movie where someone realizes, gosh, I'm sitting there, I'm never missing a single kid's soccer game, and I'm slacking at the job, and it's time I miss a couple soccer games to go do something more productive with my life. And I'll still find plenty of time for the kids, and I'll make some of the soccer games. But yeah, this notion that I'm some kind of better person because I don't care about my job at all, and I am this constant, family guy. It is a very odd view of reality. It's a very odd cinematic expression of priorities in life. And biblically, I am not trying to be provocative. I am suggesting it has our priorities wrong. That if God made us to work and be productive, and he himself was a creator, that all at once we can be a dynamic father, mother, husband, wife, and worker who need not be ashamed. And this notion that any prioritization to career proficiency is some kind of, subpar, suboptimal priority, I think is disgusting.
It's definitely interesting. I having just in the initial reading of that comment, I definitely bristled at it. And perhaps while your intention wasn't to be provocative, I think that it's important to be provocative, and it provoked something in me for sure. I was intrigued, and it did make me want to think back through the ways that films and TV shows portray work. And so I was curious what examples you guys can come up with on the negative side, films that really portray work in a work and or work ethic in a negative fashion. And so I've got a bit of a list. I just want to see what particular examples pop out to you guys on the sort of the ugly side of the good, bad, and ugly of film portrayal.
Yeah, sure. I think Dave did a really good job pointing out Hallmark movies and that sort of thing. I think that's like the obvious answer. The one that jumped out to me when I saw you wrote this down in the notes was, and it's my favorite movie of all time still, for better or worse, but I was a kid that loved The Matrix, and I still do. And just in the beginning of that film, you have like this almost juxtaposition of there's real substantial meaning out there, or there's working your cubicle, your office job, Mr. Anderson. Take the blue pill, everything's mundane. And it really, to me, thinking back through that lens, it kind of presents work as like this foil to meaning. That there's no meaning unless you get out of routine, you get out of, like, you're almost under control of some other force by just working. Like, when you really think about it that way, it's kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's important to point out that they're not doing it generally in a way that makes it easy to critique what they're doing, because by showing misery in the cubicle and showing some sort of glamorous enlightenment in being red-pilled, you're supposed to identify the protagonist one way and the antagonist another. I mean, it's always weird when a person intuitively comes away with a different protagonist and antagonist in a movie than they intended. They make the movie for a reason, you know, and it's always hard for me, like a movie like Ocean's 11, where I'm supposed to be sitting there rooting for bank robbers, you know, and it's not really my natural ethical inclination, but they're funny and good looking and charming, and the guy they're robbing is a real, you know, jerk, and so they do what they do in the movie as part of the manipulative talent of cinema. But like a movie like Family Man is the one I use in my analogy in the book, and I'm getting the impression I'm a bit older than you guys. If you said you were young when you watched Matrix, you know, because it's always a little generational, right? But I mean, Family Man came out in the year 2000, and I was already married and whatnot. But you know, the truth is that Nicolas Cage was this highly successful bachelor in New York City. He was an investment banker doing well. And then he has one of these moments where an angel comes on Christmas Eve and zaps him into his old life. But in his old life, he did end up marrying the girl, having kids, and living in a small town, working at his father-in-law's tire shop. And in, you know, the real life, he had done the whole investment bank thing and was just living this hedonistic life devoid of meaning. And it isn't just that setup, though, that I've always said, oh, geez. It's that in the plot of the movie, they gave themselves an out. That as his life was being recreated, he had an opportunity to go down a certain path, and it's still married to the girl and still with the kids, but then he was going to kind of elevate from the tire shop to getting an in back with the company, but they were like, no, that's no good. And they kind of, you know, freeze that thing out. And again, the implication was we have a dichotomy. You have a binary choice. There's a life of joy and meaning, a good life where it's simple and you're not successful in a career aspirational way, but everything has come together for you at home. Or you're a successful guy who is devoid of all meaning and intimacy and relationships and things like that. And Family Man does it really effectively, and I love the movie. But again, it's those basic premises that are bothersome. And I really do think what's interesting for you guys that have a podcast covering movies all the time, and I'm sure are big fans of movies, I think it'd be so much easier to make a list of movies that don't do it. Because I think it's embedded in almost every movie, even when it's not the underlying plot, that there is a presumed mockery of work life, that there's a mundaneness and a meaninglessness, the cubicle thing, even in a brilliant comedy like Office Space. It's still essentially mocking the kind of day-to-day activities of work. Now, in that case, it's easy to mock because everyone is ineffective and unproductive and annoying and bureaucratic. But you know, the idea that one would find meaning and joy in work, it's just not a Hollywood-friendly theme.
See, and that's interesting, because I definitely want to circle back to the good examples in a moment, because I was surprised the more I dug into the positive examples, and I'm sure we'll get a little back and forth on that. But I'm glad you mentioned Office Space, because that is sort of the quintessential, and also I believe in 1999, same year as The Matrix, same year as Fight Club, which is another quintessential anti-work message. Sort of Tyler Durden is forming his own Christ in his own image. It's a fascinating story. American Beauty as well. So 1999 was maybe the pinnacle in certain ways of films centered on this story. Rory Martin in our group, which, by the way, the examples I came up with, I'll get to later, but I ended up asking our followers on Facebook and just seeing what they had to say, and they brought some really great examples. Rory mentioned Clerks as another good example. Audrey brought up Liar, Liar, another really good illustration. And I'm sure this will trigger Richard a little bit, but Aaron mentioned The Office, although arguably it's where the magic happens, as he put it.
The Office is a mixed bag, though. I feel like it does a mix.
Right. But in terms of a positive portrayal of work, I was curious if you can think of, either of you can think of either movies or shows that portray work as a valuable or a noble pursuit.
Well, you know, a lot of people wouldn't see this as vocational work, but the movie that won an Oscar in, I think it was 1981, Chariots of Fire, and you have a Scottish Presbyterian runner, Eric Liddell, saying when he runs, he feels the pleasure of God.
Yeah.
And you know, I think that with most movies about Wall Street, they show people that enjoy their work and are good at it, and it's even kind of like attractive to watch because they're successful financially, but it's always attached to like some hedonism, you know, like nobody just loves capital markets and nobody actually loves being a financier for the sake of what their underlying work is. They love it because then they're getting women and drugs and stuff out of it, right? And that's Wall Street or Wolf of Wall Street or Boiler Room or whatnot. Yeah, and that's fine. A lot of that has to do with just demonizing Wall Street more than work. But yeah, Chariots of Fire is a interesting example from my childhood. I think that line that when he runs, he feels the pleasure of God. I think we ought to make more movies about people talking about their work as an activity in which they feel the pleasure of God.
Excellent example, for sure. Richard?
That is a really good one. I'm surprised
that didn't come up in our list either. I will say that.
Yeah, that one didn't come up. That's a really good one.
Come on, patron saints.
I don't know that I have.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know that I have any specific. So what's occurring to me, and I might pass it back to you in short order here, David, because I think you might have some more to say about this. But to me, what I'm kind of realizing is there might be stories that that highlight in a positive way a specific line of work or a specific, but something that juxtaposes work and personal life in a way that favors the work side. I don't know that I can think of anything quite like that, that actually does that. And maybe that is a message that's needed at times. I can't think of anything like that, but like you're saying, a specific endeavor, it'll show someone working hard at it and achieving. And, you know, that's sports movies all the time doing that sort of thing. And it's sort of the same idea. It's just, it's almost like it's okay in the specific, but not just the general idea of work versus personal life. It's never going to side on the side of work.
And I struggled with this quite a bit because my first thought was, okay, movies that portray work as bad, fairly easy to come up with a list. Movies that portray work as good, it got a little trickier. And I realized it's because I was not sure what job it was. I was thinking of work in an abstract. And it reminds me of, you know, an excellent moment in the show Friends. What's Chandler Bing's job? Right. He does something. He does something in an office with numbers and a computer. The job itself is irrelevant. What's the job in Office Space or The Matrix or Fight Club for that matter? Kind of irrelevant. It's a life-sucking, meaningless job in the context of the story. It's portrayed that way. But when you start to consider particular vocations, that's when I think things start to get really interesting. And just taking one that I know nothing about, law. If we were to look at good and bad examples of law, Liar Liar is a great example of the legal career being portrayed negatively. Legally Blonde, on the other hand, is portraying it a bit more positively in the joy that one gets from work, the fulfillment there. And there's plenty of other good examples. To Kill a Mockingbird, A Time to Kill, fantastic illustrations of the value of these disciplines. And then, of course, you got the sleazy Better Call Sauls on the TV end of things. So even just taking one profession, you can go a number of different directions with that. Or as Rory pointed out on their Facebook page, Spotlight and All the President's Men as great examples of journalism as a noble profession versus perhaps if there were a movie that portrayed it more negatively. But also The Pursuit of Happiness came up.
You know, but I think it's worth pointing out, though, not to contradict, but it's never clean. All the President's Men does not portray journalism as a good profession. It portrays, you know, getting a president in trouble as a noble profession. Like there was, which in that case, you know, it was a real story of real people that uncovered a real scandal and did it proficiently. But it was still, it's not what the attraction is not journalism. It is the object of that journalism. Like in that case, Watergate was this noble end. And I it's funny, as you're talking, I'm thinking about my analogy. You know, I talked about my dad loved the movie The Natural and the analogy Chariots of Fire, which also was, by the way, Chariots of Fire may have been his favorite movie. Now that I think about it, at least as I was a kid.
Nice. Nice.
But here's the thing. The using an athlete or a musician. So you think of like Mr. Holland's Opus and some of the movies that will delve into the challenges of a committed ballet dancer or musician. Even then, they often will get into how excessive the obsession was. How it was so over, the relentlessness of the teacher or the coach. And so there's still around a narrative that is calling into question the morality of this relentless pursuit of excellence.
That's an excellent point for sure.
I definitely see that. And that brings to mind like something I was thinking about a moment ago, a movie like Whiplash.
You're right.
Yeah.
Same sort of thing, like excellence, really amazing to watch. And I'm thinking to myself, like, it does sort of present the passion for it almost to a degree that it's troublesome, it's not good, it's too much. But then I think to myself, this movie is really, really well made. Like, there are people doing that to make this movie as good as it is. Like, I know there are people that are throwing themselves into their work in a way that to some might seem over the top, but I'm just not convinced that that's necessarily always a bad thing. For sure, you have other things in life you have to be responsible for and things like that. But there are people that are gifted in a certain way, and for a season, they throw themselves into a pursuit. I don't know that that's a terrible thing. I think we always kind of present it as a terrible thing.
And that gets to the idea of the idea of a work-life balance, and this is a theme that is brought up, and I should have done this, I suppose, quotes around it. I was curious if your book seems to label that term as something silly or unhelpful. I'd be very curious to hear your distinction there between a proper way to categorize those pursuits as opposed to calling it a balance, perhaps.
Well, let's start with the fact that what is it that's being balanced? It's work and life. And if you believe work is a key and integral part of life, how do you balance something with itself? So it's grammatically and linguistically incoherent unless one doesn't believe work is an integral part of one's life. But what is another major category in one's life that we think is important? Marriage? Do we ever talk about marriage-life balance? Is that a popular term? Is it something husbands go home and say to their wives? I'm working on marriage-life balance.
I'll try it because that does sound fun. I'm going to try that phrase.
You might get away with trying
Please
it
record
one time.
the reaction to that, by the way. We'd love to see it.
Yes.
Okay.
And so that to me is my point here, that the term itself stems from a mentality that is incoherent, that work is that a key part of our life is to be balanced with our life. Our life is not set against our work, and our work is not set against our life. Our work is a part of our life. Now, if what one means, as I suspect they do, that one wants to have time for work and also time for other things, such as family and church and recreation, then no problem. That's called wisdom. And if what one means is one wants to have a right paradigm for how to think about the structure of life, God described it as work-rest paradigm. He worked for 6 days and rested on the seventh. So work-life balance is a reasonably innocuous sounding term that is used for one reason only: to diminish work. No one ever says I need work-life balance so I can miss yoga to be at the office later. They say so I can leave work early so I can go to yoga. That's what work-life balance is. It's entirely asymmetrical.
That's an excellent way to describe it. I think you're right. You can't separate work from life and consider them completely separate. Because I definitely bristled at the concept because of some movies I'm going to bring up in a moment. And I'm curious of films that you guys think perpetuate this concept, this more harmful concept related to work-life balance. And maybe we already mentioned the Hallmark films were brought up already. Any other particular ones stand out that point to this?
I had Hallmark films.
I was going to say, y'all were on the same page on that one.
I mean, that is the biggest one. And I think it's, as we're getting into talking about that, bouncing off of what you said a moment ago, like work-rest balance. The interesting thing there, too, is like with work-life balance, you almost get this view like it should be 50-50 or even weighted towards the life side, which life is to the exclusion of work in that case. But like, if we're going off of what you're saying, like a work-rest balance, like it was a lot more work than it was rest. Like we're talking 1 out of 7. And yet we sort of have this view of like, if you're working more than you're spending time at the park with the kids or whatever, then you've got a major issue. I think that's definitely insightful to look at it that way. And I've never considered the dichotomy it's making there between work and life, that really they don't make sense as categories. But yeah, I don't have any others that came to mind right away. Hallmark films was the big one that just shot right to my mind. Every year for Christmas, it's the same thing. They got the woman who's got a corporate career ambition and goes home, and the guy's got a Christmas tree shop and she's got to help him save it. And she learns that she is not supposed to work all the time, and that's like always what it is. So that's the big one for me.
She learns the lesson, right? Rinse and repeat, and crank out another one 2 weeks later. Good old Hallmark.
There's a couple every year. Like it's not just
I've seen some great pictures. People will put the posters together side by side of all the Hallmark. Even the posters are identical. It's fantastically consistent.
Yes.
For sure. Any other big ones stand out to you, Dave?
No, I think we covered them, and like I said, I mean, it's the underlying trend, and sometimes it's not just the subject of the whole movie; it's the subliminal subtext. I think back to the early '90s, a lot of the movies you guys were talking from were the later '90s, and that was a really great era for movies. You know, when you have Fight Club and Office Space and Matrix all coming out in that time period, but there was a movie, Reality Bites, that came out in the early '90s that Winona Ryder, Ethan Hawke, Ben Stiller, and it wasn't just about the work side; it was also just kind of the persona. But again, Winona Ryder was trying to decide between these men in her life, and Ethan Hawke was on the couch a lot. He moped around. He was obviously this good-looking guy and everything, but he kind of was a poet who didn't have a job, or an artist type, you know, but just was really in tune with life. He wasn't going to let the man tell him what to do, where, you know, Ben Stiller was, you know, driving a BMW and wearing a tie and going to work and kind of more yuppie-ish. And the movie just portrayed it from soup to nuts, that we were all supposed to know, obviously, Ben Stiller was the wrong choice for her and Ethan Hawke was the right choice, because one person was just living life free as a bird, and the other one was, you know, a slave to his work and the man. And it was one of the early, I was a younger guy at the time. I was a young adult, but I immediately knew from the way my friends responded to the movie that there was something wrong with me, because I never understood why anyone would like Ethan Hawke. And yet he was like the protagonist of the movie. So something was just off in the way I was wired from an early
That's
age.
how I watch The Notebook. And it's not exactly for the same reasons. Well, arguably for the same reasons. I feel for James Marsden's character in The Notebook. I'm like, hold on, she left him? This is a terrible story. The morality and the values in this movie are awful. For sure. Yeah. I think that there are definitely a number of classic examples, at least that pop to my mind, of what you're describing in terms of the quote work-life balance. Hook is probably my favorite of them. You know, Peter Banning is, quote, spoilers, grown-up Peter Pan is gone and essentially has lost his youth and his innocence. Christopher Robin essentially is the same story. And in fact, we did episodes on the two of those a while back, along with Saving Mr. Banks, which points back to another great example, Mary Poppins. In Mary Poppins, we have a very similar dynamic as it relates to Mr. Banks's priorities for work. More recent examples, we already mentioned Liar, Liar, The Family Man, and also kind of a goofier one that you mentioned holiday movies earlier. Jingle All the Way is another great example, if either of you have seen the "Don't forget, you're my number one customer." You know, Arnold Schwarzenegger's obsessed with work and eventually learns he's got to care for his son. Otherwise, he'll become Darth Vader. But in terms of films that portray it well, this was a tricky one, because the notion that we don't have movies, or that we don't have enough movies that portray a motivation towards greater responsibility and work. I almost took that as a bit of a challenge, and so did some of our followers online. And so I kind of came up with a bit of a list. I mentioned To Kill a Mockingbird already, and A Time to Kill, both good examples of righteous practice of law. And also in both stories, the protagonist is someone who has to spend time away from their family, and at times even put their family a bit at risk, which is I suppose, called for in certain instances, certainly the ones portrayed in these films, both dealing with actually a pretty similar underlying social theme. And so those stood out to me as potentially the type of movie that would portray what you're looking for a bit more positively. Eric George commented with the movie It's a Wonderful Life, because he initially hates his job, kept him from making his mark on the world, but it turns out that his job at the bank and his presence in the community is actually what kept Bedford Falls together. And so there's potential there. Are there any others that jump out to either of you that might portray this a bit more positively, or a bit more biblically, I should say? I guess that's a better way to frame this. Not positive, more biblically.
I don't have a lot, so I'll defer. I will say, like, I feel like the examples we do come up with are going to be nuanced. There's going to be elements of them that align with our worldview, and then elements where we're like, well, I don't. It's still sort of a mixed bag. I mean, there are a few that occurred to me, an oddball one, and you wouldn't think kid movies would speak to this sort of thing. But someone in the group, it was Eric George, I think, brought up The Incredibles, a Pixar movie. And that one kind of shows both perspectives, where one is wanting to throw himself too much into the work, which is being a superhero in this case, and it's juxtaposed with, no, you're a family man now, you need to be here. And it's almost like they come to a somewhat healthy view by the end of it, that it's both. It doesn't have to be either or.
Also about endangering family, so that's fun. No, that's not the point of the movie, but they're superpowered, so it's a little different.
Yeah, you know, I would say a lot of the positives are ones that people would not think of as, oh, they're showing an endorsement of work here. It's implicit, and like I always, because it's subtextual. The way in which Tommy Lee Jones was pursuing Harrison Ford in The Fugitive. Harrison Ford was an innocent man, and when he finally got him, Tommy Lee Jones encountered him face to face, and Harrison said, "I didn't do this." He said, "I don't care." And his point was, you'll get a day for vindication, but my job is to arrest you. My job is to bring you in. And he did not act as a man who was disinterested in justice. He didn't believe Harrison Ford was guilty. He wasn't trying to frame him. His job was to go get him. And he did it, and yet there was no Christian message around it, and there wasn't even a reference to work commitment, but like it sort of just implied, it was like an implication, like this was his job, and he was determined to do it. And so that's just one example, but again, most of these things, even on the negative side, there's an element of subliminality to it that's going to be more important than just the hallmark level of outrageousness.
For sure. Yeah. There's always some digging involved and discretion. And that's one of the main reasons that we exist as a podcast and YouTube channel is to help people take those examples and realize that there are things that we can receive as well as things that we need to reject that are portrayed in film. And there's always nuance involved. And then, of course, most things will fall into the category of redemption, something that can be redeemed if we tweak it and we understand it correctly. But we always have to let Scripture guide our theology, not film. And that's an important balance, of course, that we have to keep straight as well, for sure. I think so many other potential examples, maybe just people can look into if they're interested. Someone mentioned Night at the Museum, Knocked Up, a movie called Warrior. And these are not all endorsements of these movies. Please don't read them as such, especially with one of the ones I mentioned. But at times we do see a portrayal of stories that can perhaps put things closer to the correct balance. And again, as always, there should be nuance, because if they're not based in the biblical worldview, then they're never going to get it quite right. And I do wonder, and time may not allow us to pursue this, but maybe folks can hash this out in the Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, all of those places. In the comments, is it possible that one of the issues here is family has replaced faith as the ultimate secular value, in particular a made family, the family of our own making and choosing? It's essentially as close as many Hollywood films get to an ultimate value or driving motivation. And so there's not much room for it to be set aside for something as God-given and dominion-based as a pursuit like work. I do think that perhaps it's equally about the importance of family that is placed in the culture, not only about the importance that is placed on work. Perhaps there's an idolization of family or a concept of family that's playing a role? I'm curious if either of you have any quick thoughts on that before we wrap up.
Well, I think that there is a lot of truth to that, although you could argue that oftentimes they decide to do a value to work replacement. They're not going to be able to get into faith or transcendent truth. And yet the substitute they use is not even a sort of general traditional understanding of the nuclear family, but some cause du jour. And so the protagonist of a movie will not be a great family person, but it will be like an Aaron Brockovich who's going to go tear down the evil lawyers or go save the environment or something. So I think these days you get more like climate religion than you do family religion.
Right. Or like you said, the idea of an assembled family. I mean, there's no shortage of examples of squads or groups that are assembled, if you will, and they become one another's family. I mean,
counterfeit
churches.
Yeah,
I was going to say the Fast and Furious movies almost make it almost take it to a comedic level in terms of the devotion to family. But so many other stories are really that, like you said, that's the counterfeit church, the body of me, not so much the body of Christ.
We could plumb that one for a while, but I want to be respectful of Mr. Bahnsen's time. We do thank you so much for joining us with your precious time and letting our listeners hear from you a little bit. Is there any preferred outlet for them to pick up the book, or is there any specific project you're working on that you'd like to point them to, or anything before we part ways?
You know what? At fulltimebook.com, there's a link to both Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And obviously it's, sold wherever fine books are sold, bookstores. And so I have no preference where people buy it. I think it's often easiest to do it online. And those links are there for that reason at fulltimebook.com. Also at that website is links to other things that I'm a part of, my investment writing and whatnot. If people want to stay in touch, there's a few different podcasts and commentaries and whatnot out there. And you already mentioned The World and everything in it Monday mornings. So plenty of ways to stay in touch, which would be my privilege to do so.
Excellent. We'll be sure to include those links in the descriptions for these videos. All right.
Love it.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us, Dave and Richard. Always good to have you back. And everyone that's watching, keep engaging media from a godly worldview, and remember that you are not a mindless consumer.
Thank you for joining us in the lobby for this discussion. To hear the rest of the conversation and for other content, subscribe on YouTube. Follow and interact on social media to share with others. Also, consider supporting us on Patreon. Donating at least $1 a month lets you vote on future episodes and get special access and bonus content. And remember, you are not a mindless consumer.